When the Mayflower arrived in 1620, it was not the beginning of the story, it was a chapter that came 100 years late. Between 1550 and 1620, European powers had already reshaped the Atlantic, and the lands the Pilgrims would soon call New England were already changed forever. In the south, Spain had conquered vast empires. In the north, France had forged trade routes and alliances. The Dutch sailed, mapped, and settled, and England kept trying to catch up. In 1585, they founded Roanoke, a small colony off the coast of Carolina. It vanished. No bodies, no answers, just one word carved into a tree: Croatoan. Colonization was not clean. It was a messy, violent experiment that often failed. But in the process, contact was constant. Indigenous people traded with Europeans, fought them, allied with them, and resisted them. Wampanoag, Abenaki, Pequot, and Narragansett nations were already navigating a century of chaos. They had seen slave raids. They had seen guns. They had seen betrayal. They had also seen ships bring sickness. From 1616 to 1619, a plague, possibly smallpox or leptospirosis, swept the northeast coast. Entire villages were wiped out. Patuxet, once a thriving Wampanoag town, was left silent. This is the land the Pilgrims would find. Empty, but not untouched. A graveyard. A ghost town. A people in mourning. And one man stood between the English and the Wampanoag. Tisquantum, captured as a child, sold into slavery, shipped to Europe, and somehow returned home. He came back to find everyone gone. He would become the bridge, the translator, the reason the Pilgrims survived their first year. But his story is no fairy tale, because this land was not given, it was taken. The Pilgrims inherited not wilderness, but a grave and a warning. The century before the Pilgrims, from 1550 to 1620, was a time of escalating conflict, disease, diplomacy, and disruption. First, the European incursions. The French, Spanish, Dutch, and English each approached the New World differently. The Spanish used missions and force, converting and controlling native populations from Florida to the southeast. The French built alliances through the fur trade, while the Dutch focused on commerce. The English, settlements, land, and eventual domination. But native nations were not passive. They resisted, adapted, and outmaneuvered when possible. Then, the mystery of Roanoke. In 1587, over 100 settlers vanished. When ships returned 3 years later, there was no trace of them. Only one word remained: Croton, carved into a post. Were they killed? Did they assimilate? The truth remains unknown, but the failure signaled how fragile English dreams still were. Meanwhile, indigenous politics were sophisticated and strategic. The Wampanoag, Narragansett, and other eastern woodlands peoples formed confederacies, led by sachems and advised by councils. One such leader was Massasoit, who rose to prominence in the early 1600s. He would become a central figure in future diplomacy, but only after devastating loss. From 1616 to 1619, an epidemic swept across the coast, likely leptospirosis, though some say smallpox or viral hepatitis. Entire villages were wiped out. Some communities lost 90% of their people. The disease cleared land for the Pilgrims, but at a horrifying cost to native nations. In 1619, something else arrived. A ship carrying 20 Angolans, captured by English privateers, docked in Virginia. This marked the beginning of African presence in English North America, a presence foundational not incidental. The lines between indentured servitude and chattel slavery would soon harden. Finally, gender and governance. In Native societies, women held political power, farmed, and led clans. In English law, women were legally bound to their husbands, stripped of property and voice. This clash led to deep misunderstandings, as Native leaders underestimated the patriarchal rigidity of the English, and settlers failed to recognize female authority among Native peoples. The century before Plymouth was not an empty stage. It was a world already in motion, shaped by epidemic, empire, and resistance. But make no mistake, this was still Wampanoag land. It belonged to Massasoit, Usamaquin, leader of the Pokanoket band. His people were weakened, but not gone. He faced a choice: resist or ally. In March of 1621, a treaty was signed: mutual defense, justice for violence, no weapons at meetings. It was not a surrender. It was a strategic alliance in a broken world. Enter Tisquantum, known later as Squanto. His life was a journey of survival. Kidnapped in 1614, sold in Spain, escaped, learned English, returned in 1619 to find Paducset gone. He became a translator, a teacher, a guide. He taught the Pilgrims to plant corn, to fish, to map the land. But his motives were not simple. He walked a line between two worlds, seeking power, survival, maybe even revenge. Still, the first year was deadly. Half the settlers died during the winter of 1620-12 to 1621-3. They scavenged, they suffered, and they depended on Wampanoag aid to survive. But this aid had purpose. The alliance had limits. This was not friendship, it was strategy. So what of the first Thanksgiving? Yes, there was a feast in the fall of 1621. But it was a harvest festival, not a religious Thanksgiving. Around 50 pilgrims, 90 Wampanoag men. The Wampanoag came armed. This was not harmony. It was diplomacy. The romantic myth of shared tables and brotherhood. It was invented in the 1800s, promoted by Sarah Josepha Hale, and cemented by Lincoln during the Civil War. The real feast? It was a pause in a longer struggle. Why does this matter? Because the myth hides the truth. It erases the deaths of tens of thousands. It erases the theft of land, the collapse of nations, the choices indigenous people had made to survive. To teach the myth is to lie. To teach the truth is to begin a reckoning. The Pilgrims were not villains, but they were not saints. They were one group arriving late on a land already rich with history. This concludes today's lesson. We must know the truth about our country and our history. Come back next week for our next exciting topic into true American history to help us out. Please subscribe to never miss a lesson. Hit like if you have learned something new that was not taught in school. Also, please share with others who love history, love our country, or want to know the truth versus myth. Thank you, and we will see you next week. God bless. This video is brought to you by Indigo-Enterprises Limited.